Yes, we are looking at one battle after another, but Europe has far more control over Russia's finances than many realize. Here is the situation. I do not like war. I especially do not like how two significant wars are ongoing at the same time, because like it or not, we are watching a world war unfold in front of us. Whether we are watching what we will eventually call World War II, though, remains to be seen. And while it is tempting to link them together in terms of drones and counter-drone systems, the stronger ties that bind fall back to something far more mundane: money. You see, there is an interesting domino effect involving the Strait of Hormuz, U.S. trade relations with India, and ultimately back to the battlefields in Ukraine. And I am sure that you have already heard about how this is a financial boon to the Kremlin during a desperate time. But I am here to discuss how the root of the problem is more subtle than it seems, and also explore what the correct countermeasures are, given the circumstances. Like I said at the top, Europe has the ability to mitigate most of these problems. So strap in, because we are about to go on a roller coaster ride. Let's start with the basics. The United States mobilizes forces to Iran. Israel assassinates the Ayatollah. What is left of the Iranian government says, hey, we don't appreciate that very much, and de facto closes the Strait of Hormuz. I have to say de facto because Iran says that it is open to everyone but Israel and the United States. An interesting take, given that only about 5% of Hormuz is transiting oil heads America's way. I also have to say de facto because HGSTH says that it is open, and that the only thing prohibiting transit in the straits right now is Iran shooting at shipping, which is a complicated way of saying that the strait is closed. Anyway, 20% of the world's oil is now stuck inside the Gulf, so oil prices have surged. Now, I have said before that everyone in the Pentagon was well aware that a shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz was a possibility. The shutdown alone would therefore not do much to force the United States to withdraw, because you need surprising information to meaningfully update information about the likely outcomes of the war. However, the American public's response to the shutdown, and specifically the White House being surprised by its own inability to handle the fallout, could have that type of effect. Lest we forget that the midterm elections are less than 8 months away, and Trump is only in office because of the previous administration's inability to handle affordability problems on Main Street. Thus, the administration has started looking for any solution to higher gas prices. The simpler, the better. Hence, discussions of suspending the gas tax or the release of oil from the U.S. strategic reserves. But the move that will have the greatest effect on the world at war is an executive action that seemed like a footnote in the broader media sphere 6 months ago. It involves India, which at least last I looked is not currently fighting a war. Then again, Pakistan is actively at war with Afghanistan, so who knows? Regardless, back in August, the United States imposed secondary sanctions on India for importing Russian oil. Yes, what was once an abstract idea that I taught students for what seemed like were purely academic purposes was now becoming a truly consequential policy. Secondary sanctions try to maintain punishment on a primary opponent by hitting someone not directly involved in the affair. That probably sounds bizarre. So, let me give you the present application. Russia attacks Ukraine. The West does not like it. So the West imposes sanctions on Russia, most of which amount to an embargo on Russian goods. Basic supply and demand economics tells us that if Russian exports, say energy commodities, no longer have as much demand, the price will go down until the goods find a willing buyer. In turn, the effect of the sanction is not the normal value of the trade good. It is the price spread between what Russian producers could previously earn and what they earn once they are stuck trying to find a backup buyer. Depending on the time period, this price spread normally ranges between $3 and $10 per barrel of oil. The winner of this is the new importer. India effectively pockets the discount. If the sanctioning parties want to be clever and do a little bit more, they can. But they need to roll out the secondary sanctions. Now, if India imports the discounted oil, Indian exporters face their own set of Western embargoes. When effective, the secondary sanctions deter India's purchase. Russian oil then no longer has a buyer, and so Russia eats the entire lost value. This is exactly what the Trump administration attempted back in August, threatening a 50% tariff if India kept purchasing from Russia. At the time, the secondary sanctions policy was met with public scorn. I guess Trump was threatening to tariff everyone around then or something, and maybe there were tacos involved. I don't know. It is hard to remember what was happening, what feels like a geopolitical decade ago. However, secondary sanctions had enormous bipartisan support among Congress. And sure enough, when combined with some trade concessions from the White House, the policy worked. Indian imports of Russian oil fell off. That is where things stood before the Iran war began. Then oil prices spiked, and the Trump administration announced that it would place a 30-day moratorium on the secondary sanctions. The logic here is straightforward. If that oil returns to the market, supply increases and global prices fall. American consumers will feel some relief, but it will also mitigate some of the international backlash to higher energy prices. Now, there are some serious limitations to what that will do. I would describe it as a Band-Aid at best, freeing up the equivalent of about 5 or 6 days of transits through the strait. It is not nothing, but there are no real good solutions beyond actually reopening the strait one way or another. Meanwhile, the Trump administration argued that the policy will not have any real effect on Russian export prices because a bunch of Russian crude is just sitting in tankers on the open seas without anywhere to go. The Kremlin already made its money at the point of departure. So, no harm, no foul. And the moratorium only applies to oil already loaded onto tankers, not any future charters that Russia may be planning over the 30-day period. Well, the economic effects are not so simple. Certainly, this policy affects perceptions of what the next departing tanker can make, so it very much does increase Russian receipts. And all of that presupposes that the secondary sanctions moratorium actually ends in 30 days, and that the Trump administration does not announce a new pause for any oil loaded in the interim. To the surprise of no one, Europe was not happy about the policy. MS Otherwise, a supporter of Trump's actions in Iran, said, "We believe it is wrong to ease the sanctions. Unfortunately, Russia continues to show no willingness to negotiate. We will therefore and must further increase the pressure on Moscow." A spokesperson for Starmer said, "It is obviously a decision for the U.S., but our position is clear. We remain committed to exerting maximum economic pressure on Russia in pursuit of a just and lasting peace in Ukraine." Macron was Pierre. The consequences of the Iran war in no way justify lifting the sanctions. Antonio Costa, president of the European Council, said, "The unilateral decision by the U.S. to lift sanctions on Russian oil exports is very concerning as it impacts European security. Increasing economic pressure on Russia is decisive for it to accept serious negotiation for a just and lasting peace." Seems like everyone is a fan of just and lasting peace. Now, I want to preface this by noting how, over the last 15 months, Europe has increased donations to Ukraine, while the United States has terminated direct financial assistance, even as it continues to offer vital intelligence support and prioritizes European arms purchases intended for Ukraine. But given those comments, what do you think that the current European position on secondary sanctions is? I suspect that if you think back to 6 months ago, and again, I know at times like these, that is a lot to ask, you may remember the answer. Trump had publicly mulled imposing a similar sort of secondary sanction on China, but indicated that he would only do it if Europe did as well. However, Europe declined both that and the secondary sanction imposed on India. So, in reference to Costa's comments, of course, it was a unilateral decision. Europe never joined in the broad secondary sanctions regime. Now, to be clear, the European Union and the United Kingdom are not letting Indian companies totally off the hook here. Importers, for example, might be barred from using European financial services. Products made from the imported Russian oil may be banned from export to Europe. That certainly will deter some companies from working with Russia, particularly the larger multinational conglomerates. But as long as it is legal, there will be some entrepreneur willing to forego business with the West to make a bunch of money from Russia. This is not the maximum pressure campaign the Star spokesperson described. Actually, quashing the profit incentive requires India to self-police. Europe has never developed that type of legislation. Consequently, all of that earlier criticism of Trump was for rescinding a policy for 30 days that Europe has not taken itself. And to be fair to Macron and MS, they do not directly control trade policy because of the European Union. There are others who are far, far bigger roadblocks, even if one of them may soon be out of a job. But it still does not change the lack of European initiative here. I do not want to belabor the point, seeing as this is a channel that seeks constructive solutions. So if these issues matter to you, then I would suggest taking it up with your representatives, because as a back-of-the-envelope calculation, Europe has the power to stop India's importing of Russian oil all on its own. We know that the United States alone had sufficient leverage over India to compel that behavior. Well, Indian exports to the United States are about $88 billion annually. Exports from the European Union and United Kingdom combined are $89 billion. Obviously, there will be some nuance between the two in practice. But on the surface, this type of threat that Europe could leverage is sufficient to induce Indian compliance under normal circumstances. Zooming out, the secondary sanctions question on India is just one part of the broader oil picture. There is no doubt that Russia, at least in the short run, is a major beneficiary of the Iran war. Only a few weeks ago, oil was trading at around $65 per barrel. At that level, the Russian federal budget could not sustain the level of effort that the Kremlin wants to put forth in Ukraine. And after years of applauding and costly but territorially successful offensive, cracks were beginning to form. Even in the midst of the Iran war starting and oil beginning its surge, Russia lost about 78 square kilometers of territory in a week. This lengthy run of Russian gains looked like it may be reversed, even if briefly. The bulk of Ukraine's progress appears to be along the front in Zaporizhia, with some tactical gains in the northeast of Donetsk. Now, there is a bunch of debate about what may be happening here. The most obvious approximate cause is the shutdown of Russian-operated Starlink terminals. That jolted Russia's command and control, thereby opening up targets of opportunity for Ukraine. Ukrainian soldiers dutifully obliged, paired with that is the Kremlin trying to restrict use of the Telegram app, which frontline soldiers have come to rely on. This immediately raises the question of how a regional power with global aspirations ends up relying on a private app for its military to communicate. But it has also fueled rumors that the Kremlin is increasingly concerned of civil resistance in Moscow and is therefore now taking proactive countermeasures. This time of year, weather always gets thrown into the discussion between winter thaws and spring rains inhibiting forward movement. But that clearly is not the full story, as that would imply a reduction in Russian gains rather than the exchange rate flipping to Ukraine's side. To draw on that further, it is possible that the weather has indeed shut off Russian gains along some sections of the front line, thereby preventing possibly competing gains from washing each other out. Finally, Ukraine claims that for the last few months, it eliminated Russian soldiers at a faster rate than the Kremlin has been able to recruit new ones. If that is true, though, it still does not quite explain Ukraine gaining ground. Russia's offensive is an inefficient system that converts flesh and blood into territorial gains. Russia losing a bit of manpower ought not to put Ukraine in the driver's seat. Rather, it should force Russia to scale back its offensive expectations and instead try to freeze the lines in some of the harder places to push forward. Consequently, something else is happening here. Maybe the shutdown of communication systems is discombobulating Russian forces, and Ukraine's gains will subside in the upcoming weeks as Russian soldiers adapt to alternative systems. Maybe there is something more structural in Ukraine recognizing a Russian strategic vulnerability. We will have to wait to see. What I can say with greater confidence is that whatever may be underlying Ukraine's offensive or loised counterattacks, it helps that there are fewer Russian soldiers on the front lines. And that takes us back to the oil question stemming from the Iran war. Remember, Russia recruits soldiers by offering competitive wages. Those wages depend on the government's ability to pay them, which in turn depends on the government's ability to absorb yet one more worker, leaving the productive civilian economy. The earlier fall in oil prices had put significant strain on the Russian economic system. Equivalently, the shock to oil prices has thrown the Kremlin a lifeline. How long it lasts depends on how long the Strait of Hormuz is under crisis. So I would feel pretty good right now if I worked in the Kremlin, but I also would not feel comfortable with the situation, and I would also need to be patient. Any increased recruitment will take a while to diffuse to the front lines. Put differently, we may very well see Ukraine do well in the figures for March, but we should not take that to mean that Ukraine can shrug off the oil situation. Again, though, Europe has the ability to mitigate the damage. Actually, Europe always had the ability to mitigate the damage. Russia needs tankers to deliver oil to the markets still willing to purchase it. But ships connected to Russia have the unfortunate geographic problem of needing to pass through areas that Europe controls. For years, Europe was reluctant to enforce its own sanctions or maritime law. That has changed, but European action remains spotty. It seems that Ukraine has done as much or more by projecting its drones out to the Mediterranean to hit Russian ships as they head toward the Suez Canal. The broader point here is that the global price of oil is irrelevant if Russia cannot move that oil anywhere. With some exceptions, the Kremlin relies on a shadow fleet of tankers. Stop the tankers and you render irrelevant whatever is happening in Iran. Of course, these mitigation steps require Europe to accept an escalatory reaction from Russia. No risk, no reward. But the Kremlin has done little to respond to the handful of seizures Europe has already tried. So stepping it up will not necessarily result in a crisis across the European continent. Meanwhile, videos do not necessarily end with me telling you about these two fantastic books about the war, the original war. But I tend to go that way whenever we talk about Ukraine. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.